agitated for Black people to be able to fight for their own freedom.
So she was an early women's rights advocate, and so she spoke very forcefully for that as well. One of the gutsiest women in American history, Black or white.
For generations, the practice of slavery used to plague our North American society. People of color used to be taken from their homes and sent far away to a place where they were forced to serve crude masters, in constant fear of being abused, injured, or even killed. When the Emancipation Proclamation was finally passed by President Abraham Lincoln, these people may have been granted their freedom, but they still cannot escape the abuse from the rest of the population. Meanwhile, the female population began to act upon the fact that they possessed less rights than men. This previously put women of color in an oppressed social status, and there were few who spoke against it other than a woman named Sojourner Truth. Around the year 1797, a girl named Isabella was born to parents James and Elizabeth Baumfree in a family of already 11. Born in the town of Swartikill, Ulster County, New York, her date of birth was not recorded. This was typical of children born into slavery. Her father, James Baumfree, was a slave captured from the area known as modern-day Ghana. Her mother, Elizabeth, was the daughter of slaves who hailed from Guinea. The Baumfree family was owned by a man named Colonel Hardenberg, who lived in his estate in Esopus, New York, which is 95 miles north of New York City. This area was once under Dutch control, which would explain why both the Hardenberg family and the Baumfree family spoke Dutch. After the colonel's death, ownership of the Baumfree family was passed down to his son, Charles Hardenberg. After his death in 1806, the Baumfree family was then separated and resold back into slavery. The 9-year-old Isabella was sold by herself at an auction along with a flock of sheep for $100. Baumfree's new owner was a man by the name of John Neely. He was known to be harsh and violent towards his slaves. Luckily for Isabella, she was sold 2 more times until a man named John Dumont bought her. She would then reside on his property in West Park, New York. It was there that she began to learn how to speak English for the first time. In 1817, Dumont compelled Isabella to marry an older slave named Thomas. Together, the couple had 3 children, a son named Peter, and 2 daughters named Elizabeth and Sophia. When the state of New York began to negotiate the abolition of slavery in 1799, it managed to emancipate all slaves on July 4, 1827. After John Dumont reneged on a promise to emancipate Baumfree in late 1826, she escaped to freedom with her infant daughter Sophia. She was forced to leave her other children behind. Isabella Baumfree eventually found out that her son Peter was illegally sold to a man in Alabama. Baumfree then took this issue to court and eventually secured Peter's return from the South. This specific case was one of the first in which a black woman successfully challenged a white man in a United States court. Little did Baumfree know that this action would light the match that would cause a string of events that would blow up the abolition and women's rights community. As soon as Isabella Baumfree was out of slavery, she converted to Christianity. She soon came to fall in love with the Methodist Church. This devotion of hers is what sparked her initiative to stand up for what she believed was right. On June 1, 1843, Isabella Baumfree changed her name to Sojourner Truth. She became convinced that God had called her to leave her city and go into the countryside and, quote, testify the hope that was in her. Sojourner then began to travel throughout the eastern states as an evangelist, and soon became acquainted with the abolitionist movement as well as its leaders. She adopted their message and began speaking out against slavery. Her speaking tours began to expand as abolitionists realized her effectiveness as a lecturer. Even though she was illiterate, Sojourner Truth managed to dictate the story of her life and publish a book entitled The Narrative of Sojourner Truth. She sold these books at her lectures so that she would have the means to support herself. In the early 1850s, Sojourner Truth met with numerous leaders of the emerging women's rights movement. One of the most notable women she met with was a woman by the name of Lucretia Mott, who was an American Quaker, abolitionist, a women's rights activist, as well as a social reformer. It was at that point when Sojourner Truth recognized the connection between the inferior legal status of African Americans and women in general. In May 1851, Sojourner Truth gave her most famous speech, Anti-a-Woman, when she attended the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio. This speech was known to challenge cultural beliefs such as natural inferiority of women and biblical justifications for the second-class status of women. This speech was recorded in the June 21, 1851 issue of the Anti-Slavery Bugle. It was edited by a man named Marcus Robinson, who had worked with Truth in the past. It was also recorded by convention organizer Frances Dana Gage, who also transformed it into the Anti-a-Woman legend. Her version of Truth's speech, complete with crude Southern dialect, was released in the April 23, 1863 issue of the New York Independent. Actress Kerry Washington reads Gage's version of the speech as part of a reading from Howard Zinn and Anthony Arnov's book, Voices of a People's History of the United States, on October 5, 2005, in Los Angeles, California.
Well, children, where there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North, all talking about rights, the white man will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages, lifted over ditches, and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages, or over mud puddles, or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Then they talk about this thing in the head. What's this they call it? Intellect. That's right, honey. Well, what's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then that little man there in the black, he says women can't have much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Well, where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they's asking to do it. The men better let them.
Gage's expanded description of the speech, as well as the impact it had upon the convention, highly romanticized the views of Sojourner Truth. This speech, as well as the others of her career, helped portray Sojourner's stance against colored and feminine inequality, as well as create the public image of the ex-slave, an image that still endures today.